The reading is from Daniel chapter 1. If anybody's using the Church Bible, it's page 883. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel's training in Babylon. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them in the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, when the chief official who the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
Thank you, Joy. I'm sorry about all the names. We haven't obviously been trained in Babylonian language. Correct. So I'm sure you've heard the question asked from time to time, who's your Old Testament hero? Any suggestions from the floor? Any others? David. Yeah. Yeah. Lots of people will say David. You might hear Ruth mentioned. You might hear Samson or Esther or Elijah. There's loads of them, aren't there? But I think I'd have to go with Daniel. He's certainly the Old Testament character that I'd most like to meet. He combined total faithfulness to God with reason and wisdom. And there's not a whiff of scandal attached to his name. No skeletons in the cupboard, unlike many of the Old Testament heroes that God used. And strangely, I think he's one of the most relatable in our modern world. So I thought I'd say a bit about Daniel this morning, who he was, and a few things I particularly admire about him, taken from events in his long life, his youth and his old age. First, a bit of background. The book of Daniel is the last of the major prophets in our Bible. Major meaning the longest, not necessarily the most important. The book can be divided into two halves. Chapters 1 to 6 tell stories from Daniel's life and show how he worked as a prophet to the kings he served. And we're going to be looking at chapter 1, which we've just heard read, then a bit from chapter 2 and chapter 5. Chapters 7 to 12 take a very different turn, actually. They're quite a different sort of writing in a way, because they're a series of visions that gave Daniel a glimpse into the relatively near future with the fall and rise of different empires in the region of the Middle East, and the far distant future, the time of the end. These visions take Daniel way out of his comfort zone, even as a prophet. They leave him overwhelmed, unlike, say, Ezekiel, who seems to take the weirdness of his visions totally in his stride. But who was Daniel, the man, in his own time and place? As we've heard, he was among the very first of the Judeans to be deported to Babylon at the start of the exile. And that's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 24, if you'd like to read that at some time. So he was part of the royal household, or the nobility, or the government of Judah. Now, the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim that we hear the setting to be in Daniel 1 verse 1 was around 605 BC. And it was also the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign as the Babylonian king. Now, he was a ruler with big ideas of empire building. He'd already defeated the feared Assyrians and the Egyptians. So hoovering up the tiny kingdom of Judah, which was already weakened by its chaotic series of bad kings, would have seemed like a piece of cake. 3 companions were forcibly removed from Judah and taken to Babylon, which is, of course, around the sort of Iraq kind of area in modern day. But there doesn't actually seem to have been much violence involved at this stage, and they don't seem to have been ill-treated by their Babylonian captors. They were young, healthy, intelligent, and well-educated, and they were therefore handpicked for training in high positions of government in Babylon. It could be seen as quite a cushy job, really. However, their enforced name change and their education in the language and literature of Babylon tell us that they were expected to forget their old cultural identity and take on a completely new one. Culture was very wide-ranging and sophisticated. It included history, laws, proverbs, and humorous stories, as well as religious mythology, spells, omens, and magical incantations. So a great deal of it would have come into conflict with Daniel's belief in Yahweh, the God of Israel. Yet there's no hint in these verses that Daniel and his friends had a problem with immersing themselves in their re-education. It posed no threat to the strong faith that they carried with them into this alien environment. That is, until they were asked to do something that directly challenged their allegiance to God. We're not told in verse 8 of chapter 1 exactly why the royal food would have defiled the Judeans. It may be that some of the foods were forbidden under Jewish law, like the laws that we read in Leviticus 11, for example. Or perhaps the food had first been offered as a sacrifice to Babylonian idols. Either way, to eat it would have gone against Daniel's conscience as a worshipper of Yahweh. So it's here that we see Daniel's line in the sand, the line he's decided he won't cross in his job as a Babylonian civil servant. But it's the way Daniel deals with this conflict that I particularly like. It clearly reveals his character and his wisdom as a diplomat. He knows exactly which battles to fight and how to fight them. He doesn't insist on his rights. He doesn't go on hunger strike or organise a protest march. Instead, he has a frank and open conversation with one person of influence, the chief official in charge of the food, in which even the official feels able to be honest about his fears and vulnerabilities. We're told in verse 9 that God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel, which, if you think about it, is another example of God working at both ends, as Simon King was saying last week. It's also another example of an unexpected source of help, like Nehemiah's boss, who Maureen was talking about a couple of weeks ago. Daniel shows respect for the official's point of view and suggests a reasonable solution that allows him to refuse the king's food while ensuring that his captor doesn't get into trouble for it. In other words, he treats the Babylonian official as a partner, not as an enemy. It's a win-win. The chapter ends with Daniel and his three friends in good standing with the king and the king's other ministers. The 4 Judeans are at the top of the class among their intake into the royal government, and they've stayed faithful to God without antagonizing their Babylonian masters. God gets the glory for their good health. And in verse 17, we're given some information that sets the scene for the next few episodes in Daniel's life, that he could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So if we now move on to chapter 2, Daniel gets another opportunity to show off his negotiation skills in a far more threatening situation for himself. King Nebuchadnezzar has a troubling dream. and he calls in his government officials to tell him what it means. And here we find out exactly the kind of person that Babylonian kings normally relied on for strategic advice: magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers. Chapter 2, verse 2. These were the wise men of Babylon, quite different from the wise men of Israel and Judah. But there's another striking contrast in this passage: the difference between King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. The great and powerful Nebuchadnezzar is suspicious of his own advisors to the point of paranoia. He's a tyrant with a troubled mind, isolated, angry, and unreasonable. He actually expects his advisors to tell him what he dreamt before telling him what the dream means. And if they can't, he'll kill them all. His demands would be laughable if they weren't so loaded with threat. Meanwhile, Daniel, captive servant, is again calm, wise, and diplomatic. He talks trustingly with everyone. He asks Arioch, his potential executioner, why the king issued this decree. He wants to understand motivation. He asks the king for more time, promising that he will be able to interpret the dream. Then he talks to his own friends and advisors, asking them, crucially, to pray. Finally, when he's come to a full understanding of the situation from every perspective, he trusts God and the dreams revealed to him. When he next sees King Nebuchadnezzar to give him the interpretation, Daniel is careful to explain to him that it is God who has revealed the dream and its meaning. It's not that he is an even better magician, enchanter, sorcerer, or astrologer than the other wise men of Babylon. He's something altogether different, a man who trusts God, listens to God, and shares God's wisdom with others. And yet, at the same time, he doesn't hold himself aloof from his Babylonian colleagues. He's counted among the king's advisors and wants to save them all from execution. It's also noticeable that Daniel is totally unafraid of Nebuchadnezzar, even when faced with the king's unhinged, murderous rage. There's no panic or stress. He takes his time. And his prayer in the middle of chapter 2 shows us the reason for his courage. He knows that it is God who deposes kings and raises up others. In the midst of other people's moral and emotional darkness, he trusts that God knows what lies in darkness and light dwells with him. Now, the next couple of chapters, 3 and 4, focus on Nebuchadnezzar, and they're really interesting chapters, and there isn't time to kind of go into all of it. There's a story about the gold statue of himself that Nebuchadnezzar has erected and the dedication ceremony that he holds for it. Does that ring any bells today, 2,500 years later? There's a story about Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace, another dream that Daniel interprets about Nebuchadnezzar's looming downfall, and Nebuchadnezzar's eventual prayer of repentance, showing that there can be hope and mercy for tyrants even after they've come into judgment. The book of Daniel jumps without warning to the reign of a different Babylonian king. We've seen the back of Nebuchadnezzar now. Now we go on to Belshazzar, who was probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. The story of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall in chapter 5 is probably set around 539 BC. So if chapter 1 was around 605 BC, Daniel is now an old man. We've skipped from his youth right to his old age. We don't know what exploits he got up to in between time. So when a mysterious human hand appears and writes a cryptic message on the wall of the banqueting hall, where the revellers are drinking from the gold and silver goblets stolen from the Jerusalem temple, someone remembers the legendary Daniel and recommends calling him out of retirement to come and explain the mystery. From the way he's described, his reputation, as I said, is totally unsullied after all these years. He has the spirit of the holy gods in him. He has insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. He has a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. This is how Belshazzar talks to him, though. He says, "Are you one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah?" In other words, are you one of those slaves from that piffling little country we conquered back in the day? And the reward he's offered for interpreting the writing is a purple robe, a gold chain, and the position of third highest ruler. Belshazzar obviously thinks Daniel should be overwhelmed with gratitude, but Daniel is not the least bit impressed. And I love the world-weary but dignified way he waves away the offer. You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Daniel has remained faithful to God through all of these years, through all the turmoil of Babylonian politics, where one ruler replaces another. He's been at the top of the tree in government in South, and he's been retired out of the limelight for some while. But the important thing is, he still knows that kings are only in position because a higher king hasn't decided to depose them yet, the higher king being God himself. He's not going to fawn or flatter or pretend to be honoured by any earthly ruler. He doesn't work for any earthly reward, so he can't be bribed. And when he does give a message to the king and then interprets the writing on the wall, which predicts the king's own doom, he tells it absolutely straight. To paraphrase a few verses, he says, "Belshazzar, you're an arrogant so-and-so who doesn't learn from history. You've continued to worship your own gods while defiling the holy objects from the true God's temple. You think you're untouchable, but God says your days are numbered." In fact, he does get the purple robe and the gold thing, the gold chain, but we don't know what he did with those. He could have sold them on the Babylonian equivalent of eBay, possibly. So what can we take from all this? There's a poem by the Victorian poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, which my favourite English teacher at school tried to get us all to learn by heart. You might have heard it. It goes like this. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal, these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretched far away. He was an extraordinary person, living in extraordinary times for his nation, in extraordinary places, in the government buildings of Babylon, one of the greatest cities of history in worldly terms, and one of the most evil according to the Bible. We're quite ordinary people. We're not at the centre of government. We don't frequent fabulous palaces, unless there's something people here haven't told me. And most of us probably aren't the victims of trauma like exile. So when we watch or listen to or read the national and international news, it's easy for us to feel helpless and hopeless. But remember that God sees everything that happens in the world. The gold statues of megalomania, the fiery furnaces of irrational rage and persecution, and the long faithfulness of his own servants, whether in the public eye or hidden in obscurity. The world's empires are rising and falling all the time. The geopolitical superpowers that we observe today, and perhaps fear, have different names than those of Daniel's day. But we can take encouragement from the fact that none of them last forever. The righteous, just and merciful, kind and challenging kingdom of God that Jesus talked about and embodied does and will last forever. So, just a few questions to throw out for you to think about. Daniel was an exile in Babylon, far from home. He was admittedly a very resilient and successful one, but he was an exile nonetheless. Do you ever feel exiled at all? Is the place or situation where you live or work entirely of your own choice, or have you been forced there in some way? Do you feel sad about that loss? How can you hold on to God in that situation? It's something to pray about, to think about, to talk about, and come to a resolution. Another question, when you're in a place where you're surrounded by people who don't follow Jesus, how do you show your faithfulness to God? Daniel didn't mind learning the language of Babylon and serving its king, but he had a line that he wouldn't cross. Where's that line for you? And do you have good relationships with unbelievers that will enable you, like Daniel and the official in charge of the food, like Naaman and the king he served, to keep to your standards without making unnecessary trouble for yourself? That might sound a bit odd because, we're told to stand up for God, to stand firm in difficult situations. But sometimes there may be reasonable and wise and faithful ways that we can come to a resolution with people who oppose us. So can you keep an eye out for those places where God is working at both ends? Can you think of people like Nebuchadnezzar who are scarily angry, or make unreasonable demands of you or of others? How do you react? And how might God help you to deal with them well? Can you stand fearless in the face of their rage? And then also, do you ever find yourself in a group of other people who are being bullied, like Daniel was among the magicians and astrologers of Babylon who were threatened with execution because they couldn't do an impossible task? How might you act as a spokesman to bring justice and protection to them all? Like Daniel, remain unswayed by both promises of reward and threats of punishment because you trust in God. And finally, how can you learn and be encouraged by Daniel's example of calm and fearless trust in God when everything around you is in chaos? Can you follow his example of openness, diplomacy, prayer, and action at just the right moment? So next time you hear news of the latest tyrannical acts of world leaders, east, west, or anywhere in between, can you put away fear and disgust and turn instead to prayer, trusting in the God whose kingdom will last when every other empire is just a colossal wreck in the middle of lone and level sands? We're going to sing a last hymn, Be Thou My Vision. Our vision is the High King of Heaven, and at times it's easy to lose sight of that, but he is always there, and our hope is in him. Say the grace to one. May the grace of Jesus Christ, love of God, and fellowship of the Spirit, be with us ever.